Question number 1. If truth is absolute, why so many versions? Let's start gently, because this question doesn't arrive with violence, it arrives with curiosity. If your belief system represents ultimate truth, not partial truth, not symbolic truth, but absolute truth, then why does it fracture so easily? Why does something described as eternal and unchanging arrive in thousands of conflicting versions? Same God, same sacred names, same core stories, same claim of divine origin, yet somehow entirely different conclusions, different rules about life and death, different definitions of morality, different ideas of who is saved and who is condemned. And here is the part most people quietly avoid. Every believer is completely certain their version is the correct one, not mostly correct, not approximately true, completely right. And everyone else, billions of people, sincere, devoted, praying just as hard, are simply wrong. Not because they rejected truth, but because they were taught something else first. So pause here and really think. If there is one ultimate truth, one divine message meant for humanity, which version did God actually choose to reveal it through? And more importantly, why was that revelation so fragile that it shattered into contradictions almost immediately? Why did it require councils, revisions, interpretations, denominations, sects, schools, and endless debate just to explain what an all-knowing being supposedly said clearly? And then comes the question people feel but rarely say out loud. Why would a just God allow sincere people to be born into the wrong version of truth, raised from childhood to trust it, love it, and shape their entire identity around it, only to be punished later for believing exactly what they were taught? If truth is absolute, confusion should be impossible, yet confusion is everywhere. That contradiction is not small, it is foundational, and once you see it clearly, belief stops feeling like certainty and starts feeling like inheritance. And that realization leads somewhere far more unsettling, because this belief was never as universal or timeless as it claimed to be. And that is where things begin to unravel. Question number 2. Why does faith depend on geography? Here's a simple thought experiment, and it sounds harmless at first, but it has sharp edges if you follow it all the way through. Imagine you were born somewhere else. Not just a different city, but a different part of the world. Different parents, different traditions, whispered into your ears before you could speak. Different stories told to you before you learned how to question. Different language shaping the way your mind learned to think about reality. Now pause and ask yourself honestly, would you believe the same thing you believe now? Statistically, the answer is no. Not slightly different. Completely different. Your God, your rituals, your idea of heaven and hell, your definition of sin and virtue would almost certainly change. Not because you suddenly became less intelligent or less sincere, but because belief arrived before choice ever did. Faith didn't enter your life as a conclusion, it entered as an environment. Christian countries overwhelmingly produce Christians. Muslim countries produce Muslims. Hindu regions produce Hindus. This pattern is so consistent that it borders on mechanical. Same human brains. Same emotional needs. Same fear of death. Same longing for meaning, yet radically different answers to the biggest questions of existence. That alone should stop us from pretending belief is purely about truth. So ask yourself the uncomfortable question without rushing past it. Is belief guided by truth? Or by accident? By revelation? Or by location? Because if truth were self-evident, geography wouldn't matter. Gravity doesn't change across borders. Mathematics doesn't depend on culture. But belief does. And here is where the logic tightens. If faith is determined largely by where you were born, how can disbelief be framed as a moral failure? How can someone be blamed for not accepting a belief they were never raised to find plausible? If belief is destiny shaped by geography, then disbelief is not rebellion, it is circumstance. Hold on to that realization, because once you see belief as inherited rather than discovered, the idea of punishment, judgment, or reward starts to feel deeply misplaced. And that discomfort is not accidental. It's the beginning of seeing faith, not as a divine test, but as a human pattern. And that pattern leads somewhere most belief systems desperately try to avoid. Question number 3. Why does an all-powerful God need worship? This question sounds simple at first, almost harmless, but the longer you sit with it, the heavier it becomes. Why would a perfect and infinite being require constant praise, not appreciation, not gratitude, but ritualized worship, repeated declarations of loyalty, and endless affirmation of greatness? Pause for a moment and really think about what that implies. An all-knowing God already knows who He is. There is no uncertainty to resolve. An all-powerful God lacks nothing. There is no weakness to compensate for. An all-loving God should not need validation, applause, or submission to feel complete. And yet, entire belief systems orbit around a single demand. Worship me, acknowledge me, exalt me, or face consequences. Sometimes those consequences are subtle. Sometimes they are eternal. Now ask yourself honestly, is that the behavior of divine perfection, or does it resemble something deeply human? Because when humans demand unconditional praise, punish dissent, and equate disagreement with moral failure, we do not call that virtue. We call it ego. We call it insecurity. We call it narcissism. We recognize it as a desire for control disguised as authority. So why does the standard change when the subject is God? Why does behavior that would be alarming in any human leader suddenly become holy when attributed to a cosmic one? If God is truly beyond human flaws, why does His emotional framework mirror our most fragile instincts so closely? And here is where the question sharpens. If worship is not for God, who gains from it? If an infinite being gains nothing from praise, then the demand must serve another function: social cohesion, obedience, hierarchy, control. Suddenly worship stops looking like reverence and starts looking like a mechanism. And this is where things begin to unravel, because once you question the necessity of worship, you are forced to ask whether devotion was ever about divine need at all, or whether it was always about human systems maintaining power. And that realization leads somewhere far more unsettling than doubt. Question number 4. Why create hell at all? Let's slow down here, because this question deserves patience. Not defensiveness. Not rehearsed answers. Just quiet, honest thought. Why would a loving God create eternal punishment for temporary mistakes? Not centuries of wrongdoing. Not infinite harm. But finite lives filled with confusion, fear, limited knowledge, and inherited beliefs. A few decades of uncertainty, followed by endless suffering with no expiration date. Finite lives, finite understanding, finite mistakes, infinite punishment. That imbalance alone should stop the conversation cold. There are no appeals in hell, no opportunity to learn, no rehabilitation, no moment where suffering has accomplished its purpose and mercy steps in. There is no growth, no correction, no redemption. Just endless pain, and all of it justified not by cruelty, but by righteousness. So ask yourself a question that matters more than doctrine. What crime committed in ignorance deserves infinite torment? What misunderstanding, what doubt, what failure to believe the correct story merits suffering without end? Even human justice systems, flawed and imperfect as they are, reject this logic. We understand that punishment without proportionality is injustice. We understand that eternal penalties for finite actions are immoral. So why does divine justice embrace a standard we would condemn in any human authority? Why is mercy celebrated in humans, but absent in God's most extreme judgment? And if hell exists primarily to scare people into belief, then we have to ask what kind of belief that produces. Is it moral persuasion, or is it coercion? Because fear does not produce truth. Fear produces obedience. Fear produces silence. Fear produces people who say the right words and suppress the wrong thoughts. And that distinction matters, because a system that relies on terror to sustain belief is not revealing truth, it is enforcing compliance. And once you see hell not as justice, but as leverage, the entire moral structure begins to crack. Question number 5. Why hide evidence but demand belief? This question quietly dismantles entire sermons because it doesn't attack belief directly. It questions the rules of the test itself. If God truly wants belief, not blind obedience, not inherited loyalty, but genuine conviction, then why remain invisible? Why communicate through silence, ambiguity, and absence rather than clarity? There are no verified appearances that withstand scrutiny, no unambiguous evidence that removes reasonable doubt, no repeatable miracles that can be observed, tested, and confirmed. Instead, there are ancient stories written long after the events they describe. Second-hand and third-hand accounts pass through generations of copying, translation, and interpretation. And layered on top of all of it, a warning that doubt itself is dangerous. Now imagine a teacher who never shows up to class, who never explains the material, who never answers questions, but still hands out a final exam and punishes students who fail it. Would you call that fair? Or would you recognize it immediately for what it is, an impossible standard dressed up as responsibility? Belief without evidence is not faith. It is obedience without confirmation. It asks people to surrender their most reliable tools for understanding reality, logic, observation, and reason, and replace them with trust in authority. And once that substitution is made, anything can be justified, any claim can be protected, any contradiction can be excused. This is why the absence of evidence is never treated as neutral. It is reframed as a virtue. Doubt becomes weakness, skepticism becomes rebellion, and belief becomes a moral obligation rather than a rational conclusion. That precedent is dangerous because a system that demands belief without evidence can never be corrected. It cannot self-examine. It cannot admit error. And when belief becomes immune to reality, reality always pays the price. Question number 6. Why do sacred texts reflect their time so perfectly? Look closely, because this question only reveals itself if you stop treating sacred texts as untouchable and start reading them carefully. Why do holy books mirror the culture, knowledge, and prejudices of the eras in which they were written so perfectly? Not approximately, not symbolically, but in precise alignment with the worldview of ancient societies. Their cosmology reflects a time before astronomy. Their science aligns with pre-scientific understanding of disease, biology, and nature. Their morality is tribal, focused on survival, loyalty, and obedience rather than universal human rights. You see rules about slavery treated as acceptable, women reduced to property or silence, violence justified, commanded, even celebrated under divine authority. These were once called eternal laws. Today, we reject them. And that contrast matters, because if these texts were inspired by an all-knowing God, why didn't they get basic things right? Why didn't they anticipate future knowledge instead of reflecting ancient ignorance? Why didn't they clearly condemn practices we now recognize as immoral, instead of quietly accommodating them? So belief systems are forced into an uncomfortable position. They must reinterpret, reframe, translate, soften. Eternal truth becomes flexible, not because truth changed, but because morality did. Verses once taken literally are now described as metaphor. Commands once defended are now contextualized, not because God clarified them, but because society moved on. And here is the pattern that cannot be ignored. Moral progress consistently happens after religion loosens its grip. Slavery declines not because Scripture suddenly condemned it, but because human empathy expanded. Women gain rights not because ancient texts evolved, but because people challenged them. Violence decreases not through divine revelation, but through secular ethics. That pattern isn't accidental. It suggests something deeply unsettling. That morality is not handed down from above, frozen in time. It grows upward, shaped by human experience. And once you see sacred texts as reflections of their time rather than messages beyond it, their authority begins to look inherited, not divine. Question number 7. Why is doubt treated as a sin? This question reveals everything, because it exposes the difference between truth and control. Why is honest questioning punished? Why does simple curiosity trigger fear instead of dialogue? If a belief is true, genuinely true, doubt should not threaten it. Doubt should strengthen it. Questions should sharpen understanding, not end conversations. But instead, doubt is framed as rebellion. Curiosity is labeled dangerous. Questions are described as temptation, weakness, or moral failure. And that framing is not accidental. It serves a purpose. Systems built on truth invite scrutiny. They improve under pressure. They welcome challenges because challenges reveal weaknesses that can be corrected. But systems built on authority fear scrutiny. They rely on obedience, not understanding. They survive by teaching people not how to think, but what to think. So ask yourself a question that cuts through everything. What kind of truth collapses under questions? What kind of belief requires silence to survive? Because if asking why is enough to destabilize a system, then the problem is not the question, it is the system. And notice how early this conditioning begins. Children are taught what to believe long before they are allowed to ask why. Stories are presented as fact before critical thinking is developed. Obedience is praised as virtue. Doubt is discouraged before it ever fully forms. By the time questioning feels natural, guilt is already attached to it. That is not education. Education teaches you how to evaluate claims. This is conditioning, and conditioning works frighteningly well because it doesn't just control behavior, it controls thought. It teaches people to police their own curiosity, to feel shame for wondering, and to equate certainty with goodness. Once doubt becomes sin, belief becomes immune to correction. And when belief cannot be corrected, it no longer serves truth. It serves power. Question number 8. Why does God sound suspiciously human? Think carefully about God's personality as it is described, not in sermons, but in behavior. Anger, jealousy, pride, favoritism, these are not abstract cosmic qualities. They are deeply human traits. They are emotions we recognize immediately because we experience them ourselves, and that familiarity should give you pause. God loves those who worship Him and rewards loyalty. He punishes those who doubt, question, or refuse submission. He becomes offended by disbelief. He demands obedience, praise, and devotion. In other words, God behaves less like a timeless, transcendent intelligence and more like a ruler from the ancient world, a king who governs through authority, fear, and allegiance. This makes sense when you consider the historical context. Ancient societies were built around hierarchy. Kings ruled by divine right. Loyalty was sacred. Disobedience was treason. Power was personal. And the gods of those societies reflected that structure perfectly. They were not neutral forces of reality. They were amplified versions of human rulers, complete with tempers, preferences, and punishments. So ask the forbidden question, the one people are trained to avoid. Did humans create God in their image, projecting their own psychology upward into the heavens? Or did a cosmic being somehow inherit the emotional profile of ancient men in power? Because the resemblance is not subtle. It is precise. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. As cultures change, God changes with them. His rules soften, His priorities shift, His punishments are reinterpreted. Traits once celebrated are quietly abandoned, not because God evolves, but because humans do. If God were truly beyond time, culture would not reshape Him. But if God is a mirror, reflecting the values and fears of those who imagine Him, then His humanity is not a coincidence, it is a clue. And once you see God as a psychological reflection rather than an external authority, the origin of belief starts to look far less divine and far more human. Question number 9. Why is salvation about belief, not behavior? Here's the moral paradox that quietly undermines the entire structure. Why does belief matter more than kindness? Why is what you think rewarded more than how you act? In many belief systems, a compassionate non-believer who lives with empathy, honesty, and care for others still risks punishment. Meanwhile, a cruel believer who professes the correct doctrine can receive forgiveness, redemption, and eternal reward. Sit with that for a moment. What kind of moral system places allegiance above ethics? Because in practice, salvation is not about reducing suffering, increasing compassion, or improving the world. It is about loyalty to an idea, about affirming the correct story, about saying the right words with the right certainty. So, morality shifts. It stops being measured by how you treat others and becomes measured by whether you belong, whether you are inside the group, whether you accept the doctrine. And once morality becomes tribal, it stops being universal. Outsiders are judged by different standards. Their goodness counts less. Their suffering matters less. Is that justice? Or is it tribalism dressed up as salvation? Because a system that values belief over empathy does not encourage moral growth. It encourages conformity. It rewards obedience and excuses harm as long as it comes from the right side. And this is where belief becomes political. Power always follows belief. When salvation depends on doctrine, those who control doctrine control access to moral legitimacy. They decide who is righteous and who is lost, who deserves compassion and who deserves condemnation. That is not an accident. It is a structure. A system designed not primarily to cultivate goodness, but to preserve allegiance. And once you see salvation as a mechanism of loyalty rather than a measure of character, the moral authority of belief begins to look less ethical and far more strategic. Question number 10. Why does free will come with eternal threats? You're told you have free will, and that idea is presented as proof of God's fairness. You are free to choose, free to decide, free to believe or not believe. But there is a catch that changes everything. Choose wrong, and you suffer forever. Not temporarily, not proportionally, eternally. That is not freedom. That is a hostage situation. Imagine someone saying, "You are free to leave whenever you want, but if you do, I will burn your house down and hunt you for the rest of your life." No one would call that a choice. We would call it coercion. Consent given under threat is not consent at all. So why is this logic accepted when it is framed as divine justice? Why is eternal punishment treated as compatible with free will when it directly undermines it? A choice made under infinite threat is not an expression of freedom. It is an act of self-preservation. And the contradiction deepens. If God already knows every decision you will ever make, then the outcome is fixed before you are born. Your beliefs, your doubts, your actions are already known. So what exactly are you free to change? If the ending is written in advance, free will becomes a performance, not a reality. This is not theology, it is logic, and logic does not bend for faith. A system cannot simultaneously claim that choices are free, outcomes are predetermined, and punishment is just. One of those claims must collapse. And when it does, what remains is not divine mystery, but a structure that relies on fear to simulate freedom. Question number 11. Why are miracles always conveniently unverifiable? Miracles are always happening, but notice where and when they occur. Far away, in places you cannot verify. Long ago, in eras without records, cameras, or controlled documentation. Or just out of range, just after the battery died, just before the camera turned on. Close enough to inspire belief, distant enough to escape scrutiny. They never occur under controlled observation, never when independent verification is required, never when skeptics are present with instruments, questions, and repeatable tests. The moment standards are raised, miracles become stories instead of events. And there is a pattern that grows clearer with time. As science advances, miracles retreat. Diseases once cured by prayer are now cured by medicine. Conditions once attributed to divine intervention are now explained by biology, psychology, or chance. The more we understand the world, the less space there is for the miraculous to hide. So ask yourself the uncomfortable question, is God becoming quieter, or are we becoming more honest? Because if miracles were real phenomena, they would withstand examination. Gravity does not vanish when studied. Electricity does not weaken when measured. Real forces become clearer under scrutiny, not more elusive. Only stories disappear when examined too closely. Only claims that cannot survive evidence require distance, mystery, and reverence to protect them. And when miracles are always just beyond reach, just beyond proof, belief stops being about witnessing reality and becomes about trusting authority. That shift matters, because once miracles rely on absence rather than presence, they function not as evidence, but as persuasion. And persuasion without verification is not revelation, it is storytelling. Question number 12. Why is leaving treated like betrayal? There is one final pattern that ties everything together, and it is impossible to ignore once you see it. Why does leaving a belief system come with such a heavy price? Why does it cost people their community, their family, their sense of identity, and sometimes even their safety? These are not small losses, they are the foundations of a human life. Truth does not punish departure, control does. When something is true, it does not need threats, shame, or exile to keep people inside. People remain because reality keeps confirming it. They stay because it holds up under questioning. They leave freely and others are free to follow. But belief systems often react very differently. Leaving is framed as betrayal, questioning is treated as disloyalty, distance is interpreted as moral failure, and the punishment is not abstract. People are cut off, relationships are strained or destroyed, love becomes conditional on agreement. If belief were truly self-evident, no one would need to be shamed for leaving. No one would need to be warned about curiosity. No one would need to fear asking the wrong questions. The truth would speak for itself. And yet people lose everything simply for thinking differently. They lose family support. They lose friendships built over decades. They lose their place in the world they were raised in. Not because they harmed anyone, but because they stepped outside the boundary of belief. That should tell you something. Systems that equate disagreement with betrayal are not protecting truth. They are protecting themselves. And when belonging is conditional on belief, belief stops being about understanding reality and becomes about survival.